Okay. So the stick I want to start with, where I'm hoping there'll be lots of participation, is with Peter Pan. So, right. So one of the early scene of Peter Pan, the way Peter first gets to meet Wendy and everyone else, is because as he's escaping, his shadow gets trapped in the room, and then later, right, he comes back to get the shadow, and he's crying, and he's crying. He says because he can't get his shadow to stick on, and Wendy immediately realizes that it must be sewn on, right? Because boys don't know about that. And she sews it on, and then Peter immediately forgets that she has sewn it on. And there's a lot of gender satire and lots of ways going on here. But the interesting notion that the person's shadow is part of them and can be separated from them. And even though in the play, the original play, not so much as made of the original novel, but later on, Disney makes a lot more out of the shadow. The shadow comes to life itself. So what do you understand? Right? Say, what does it mean for Peter Pan to have? What is a person's shadow that goes with them? Is there any symbolism here at all? Right? What would it mean? What would it mean for someone to have a shadow? Not all at once.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily ever ascribed any specific meaning to it. I just sort of, not that I've seen it since I was 12, maybe. I can never take Sandy Duncan very seriously anyway. But I just always thought it was part of the fantastical, motif. I didn't really.
Okay, right. So that could be right. It could be that there's no significance to it at all, right? That it's just it's just a shtick. Like you can believe in shadows are more real than fairies, presumably, and they exist whether or not you believe in them. But we could say, look, at Peter lost his shadow, fine, and it doesn't tell us anything about the nature of who Peter Pan was. We can't really talk about the difference between someone who has a shadow or someone who doesn't have a shadow. Okay. Did anybody take it more seriously than that? Whether or not they have a Sandy Duncan issue? Okay, one could, usually we.
So I started saying that, but it was muted. The other part of it, the also notion of like, I think at least in that period of time, things about vampires, notion of vampires didn't have vampires couldn't see their image in a mirror or shadow. So, maybe it sort of somehow takes them out of the Olam Hazeh status in some level.
Okay, interesting. Right, so that's right. 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 Vampires don't have shadows. Right. That's very famous. Right. There's the marvelous Parashat episode about that. If you know about that. And why don't vampires have shadows? So to have a shadow means to be somehow alive. Or right, we could be darker. We could say that to have a shadow is to have the possibility of death. Vampires don't have shadows, right? Vampires have shadow because they're not alive, and to be alive means to have the possibility of death, right? That would be a more radical reading. Or we could talk about shadow selves in terms of right, in other kinds of literature. Your shadow self is your Yetzer Hara, and your Yetzer Tov, and that would also be an interesting thing that Peter Pan is separable that way because he never grows up. Interesting question, right? What Yetzer Leif Adam Raminu Rav means? Okay, good. Right, I think the connection to vampires is really excellent. Okay, now why am I thinking, right? What's the shtick that connects that to this week's parsha? Maybe more than a shtick. Is we have in Parashat Shelach, right? So the Jews say to each other, Perek Yudalet Pasuk Dalet, Nitna Rosh V'Nashuv Mitzrayma, right? Which either means, right? Depends what you think the Rosh means. Either we'll give ourselves a direction, or we'll appoint somebody, and we'll return to Mitzrayim. And Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces before called Chadat and Israel. And Yoshua ben Nun and Kaleb ben Funeh, among those who were spying the land, the frame of the Aretz, wear their clothes, and they make the following speech to Chadat and Israel. Aretz asher avarnu ba'laturot, the land that we traversed in order to spy it out. The land is very, 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 very good. I wonder, as you say, whether the repetition of Ode sends some people back to Reb Meir's right, the Tov Mode on Yomashi, V'yarkul Kol Asher Asavni Tov Mode. Reb Meir says Tov Mode the Yitzhar. Somebody says Tov Mode the Yitzhar. Reb Meir says Zemita. I wonder if the Mode, in terms of what they saw as the people dying, is somehow referenced here. Okay. Im Chafetz Banu Hashem. If God finds us desirable, so he brings us to this land. He gives it to us. Eretz Asher is Avat Chalav V'Dash, right? Flowing milk and honey, we all know that. Okay. Hashem al timrodu, don't rebel against God. Ve'atem al tiru'et am ha'aretz, and don't be afraid of am ha'aretz, which for now we're going to translate as, right, I think this week we'll translate as the nation. Right, the people already, don't be afraid of the people who are currently living there. Right, very vivid image, because there are bread. Sar tzilam me'alehem. What does sar tzilam me'alehem mean? The correct simple literal translation is that their shadows have departed from them. And God is with us, don't be afraid of them. And then everybody's reaction to the speech is to try to stone them, and then Hashem appears in Olam Moed. So what I want to talk about this week is really from a straight Parashat perspective, although we'll see, often going through all the Parashatim takes one into wild detours. What does it mean that their shadows have, or their sail has vanished from them? So shadow, we can already figure out the English analogy is in English, right? There's shade, right? So a shade and a shadow are connected, and to be in sail is to be a shade. But we'll see that there's at least one other word that is called to mind in Hebrew by Silam, other than maybe at least two other words, I would say, other than just the word sail. So what are they? What does it mean, right? When Yeshua and Kalev turn to them and say, their shadows are gone. Does it mean they're vampires? So that wouldn't be so encouraging. It's hard to defeat vampires. Maybe they're just distributing garlic. And so right, are the ideas that we suggested for Peter Pan that way, right? Are they possible to relate that to the way in which Yeshua and Kalev relate to the Canaanites? Douglas says, Aryeh bin Mitsirin Ada Tukfahon Minhon. Ada Tukfahon, I think, means the crowns of their strength. Okay, so that's why is that a sail? Okay. The Yerushalmi says Chil Gevurton, or Chel Gevurton, which is again the force of their. So Gevurton could mean just their power. It could mean their masculinity. Right, there is a sort of I don't know. It could be some kind of body humor going on. That on the one hand, right, because we're later on. Later when in the Haftorah, right? So Rachav Hazona, right? Rachav who leads everybody to Yossi Carrie just reciting her name. So it also she's going to make the claim, Lokam Ish Mipnechem, right? She claims that actually, right, there's no, right, all of Canaan has become impotent out of fear of the invasion of Bnei Israel. So it could be that Phil Gevorton's reference to masculinity here as well. Okay, right. So far, what we haven't seen is any real relationship to the word sail. Okay, right. Sorry, the Yerushalmi, if right, we take the insertion of the text of Art Flehon Meilahon, right? So gesture there tells you that Flehon is their coverings, like their tablecloth is off. Okay, what does that mean? Ibn Ezra says, Art Silam, Ki Gibor. Im ein lo magen she'agen alav v'yetzel alo bo yira. So that is a very interesting notion that people get very afraid when they don't have their shields. Courage, to some extent, is a function of having a shield, and so therefore, to lose your sail is, in a sense, to lose your gvura. So that's an interesting claim. If it's not obvious to me that warriors in all eras had shields. If that's an interesting claim. And that courage is a product of having a shield is a very strange and odd claim. That I find it very hard to fix. There's just a very odd notion of courage. Courage having a shield, shields don't make you invulnerable. Although it's certainly a question of what your psychological effect is, and this is something that we're talking, that we're dealing with, worth thinking about in terms of Iron Dome, like the way in which your psychology changes when you have a shield, even though your shield is not invulnerable. But there's just it makes you feel less. It makes you feel less helpless if you have defense as well. Marty, do you want to say something?
Can you hear me? I'm not sure what happened. I'm sorry.
I can hear you.
Oh, you do? Okay. Something weird happened to my screen. No, I was going to say that, a skilled warrior is not going to go into battle naked,
without a shield.
right? It's prudent. It'd be false bravado. So the true Gibor, right? Takes all of his tools with him.
It's true, but are you in fear specifically because of the lack of a shield?
Not about fear, but you certainly would be
Hesitant.
hesitant, and you'd see yourself at a disadvantage, and less than you'd be going out there less than 100%.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I find a little bit of an odd metaphor. I can't argue with you. Okay, that's Ibn Ezra. Now, and what they're all trying to do, right? Basically, all these readings, right? All these readings seem to seem to be saying that it's obvious in context that what Yeshua means. Right? It's obvious in context that what Yeshua. I think you should mute yourself again, Marty. It's obvious in context that what's going on is that Yeshua and Kalev are claiming that they're all afraid of us, and this is all related to Namogu Kli Shveichanan and as Yashir and in Rachov's claim that everybody is afraid of them, and we're trying to get the word Sar Tzilam Elohem to mean that they're afraid. But it's not obvious that that's what it means. So the Ktav Kabbalah of Mecklenburg in the 19th century, it tries a different way of getting it. Right? It's Tamar, they're not in the shade, and therefore they're going to get sunstroke. Because we have an example of a lack of shade leading to weakness. The example is, right, Yonah faints when the kikayon at the end, right, that's the vine that's serving as its shade is struck down. So too, right, we're claiming is that they're out, that the Canaanites are now out in the sun without parasols. Okay, that to me is an even weirder way of trying to get lack of shade to mean, right, to mean all of a sudden they're afraid, right? He says, right, because when you're afraid, you're faint. So you're faint. All right, it seems to me that what's going on, they're just struggling. They're struggling very hard to find a way to connect the language to what they think it has to mean. Rashbam tries it, right? So you have translations which don't help us very much, right? In the Targumim, and then you have Ibn Ezra who claims that they're in the position of a warrior, feeling sort of naked without their shield. And Ktav Kabbalah says they're out in the sun without a parasol. Rashbam says, "Sar Tzilam Elohem, ein lehem machseh lachasoto, ki kvar namogu kol yoshvei aretz mipneinim mish'ashav v'shiam, kimosh amar Rachav Azona." So it's not entirely clear what that means. Right? They don't have a cover to be covered by. They feel exposed. It could be that that there's nobody they can turn to. That usually people have it, right. Part of what gives people a sense of security is that there's somebody else who will defend them. Right, somebody else gives them courage, and so they have no one to get courage from, because it says Namogu Kol Yoshveichanan. That seems to be that's the best way of reading Rashbam right now. And in general, he's just developing this idea like that people are afraid when they're exposed. So That's a version of Ibn Ezra without specifically relating to the experience of warriors. Just generally, right? Generally, being exposed is a scary feeling. Okay, right. So that's I think a whole series of commentaries who are trying to bridge what they're sure is the meaning with the word sail, and basically trying to come with a literal meaning of the word sail, and somehow trying to make it a metaphor for fear. Rav develops, I think, a more extreme version of this. Right, he starts Yilam Elam. He says, So he says everything that protects you is a shade, right? So shade generally is a metaphor for protection, right? Sail means the same thing as magain. Now, but here's what he said: they are capable of surviving. Right, so they can only survive so long as they're hiding in the shadow, and nobody can see who they are. Right, so they survive only when they're not exposed. But now he's trying to say literally, right? What is Yeshua and Kali saying? Then when we enter them, Hashem. So then God comes with us, with his truth, and with his judgment, right, which brings victory, salvation. And in the light of this, the radiance of this truth, so now that right, the bright light of God's truth will dispel the shadows they're hiding in, and their moral corruption will appear in its fullness by the light of the sun. And because of this moral corruption, they will be judged. Okay, so here's the reason that Canaanites feel exposed, but Yeshua's not even talking about their feeling. It says is that they are living currently without direct divine judgment, and our coming into their midst will bring divine judgment. And so don't worry about them, right? Because the shadow that has hidden them from God's judgment will disappear. So that's a totally different way of reading it, right? It's not about the psychology of the Canaanites at all. It's a theological claim that Bnei Israel's president is going to uncover them, and therefore there's no reason to be afraid, which is an sort of ironic thing for Yeshua to be saying at the moment of the Jewish sin. But okay, right? That's his claim. So it totally changed the axis of discussion. Now, first is well aware that Rashi says, Sarat Silam, Maginam v'cheskam. Rashi sort of fudges, right? Their shield and their strength. I guess it's a hendides. It means something between shield and strength, or some combination. Fine. But Rashi says, what does it mean? Right? That Yeshua and Kalev are making a claim about virtue, but not that the Jews' virtue will expose them by comparison, but rather the last virtuous members among them have died. Right? So they're going to claim that Eov has been living in Canaan, and with the presence of the and he's died just now. So Yeshua and Kalev are making an empirical claim. They no longer have anyone virtuous enough, and presumably that would this is a connection. That's the funeral that they're observing when they enter Eretz Yisrael, is the death of Eov or others among them. Okay, so that's a fascinating claim. We have to figure out how they know it, and why is it that that their work Sherem Shemim, the Sherem Shemim are not capable of reproducing, and how do we put that in the context of Rachel, who appears to be a Kshera, but I guess she's not a Kshera enough to make it on more than her family. Interesting claim. All right, so now with so as opposed to you draw strength from other people's courage, you draw protection from other people's virtue. Right, obviously, right. Rashi is is carrying the idea that of the tzaddikim of stone, right? So maybe there were 10 virtuous Canaanites yet who were capable of protecting them from God's judgment. Okay, Shlomo Ganzfried, the author of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, quotes Rashi. And he quotes Sforno, who says that they no longer right and draws a connection to Rachav, and says that there's no longer any means that they regard themselves as bread. Interesting, we could try and contrast that to the other spies say, right, that we saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and but they and right. So Yeshua and Kali respond as they saw themselves as bread, and we saw them as bread too. But then he offers another literal reading. V'ra'inu v'hiskimu shehiskimu lazov kol magen b'tzina ishimru l'nos b'pnechem. Parashat means they have already thrown away their shields. They've already thrown away their shields in the expectation of our coming, and they're just planning to run away. So Sar Silam Elohim is not a third person, is not a Sar is not that it is not in the it's not indirect. I'm blanking on the phrase that the missing subject. It means that they themselves threw their shadows away. Okay, interesting, fascinating empirical claim. The assumption there is that had the Jews succeeded in entering then, there would have been no battles. It's only because the Chedem Raglim there are battles at the end. On the other hand, he connects it to Rachav, which happens after the Chedem Raglim, so tough to know how you fit that. Okay. He thinks that Rashi is right. He has a very fancy reading because he thinks that the word Yura, when connected by Et, relates to Yuras Haromimus, right? So right, there's always two kinds of Yura, there's fear and awe. And Tzira, he thinks, always means Yiras Haromimus, and therefore, obviously, on a spiritual plane, I have to say I don't find this terribly convincing at all. And so we're left with so far two models of Sar Tzilam. One model of Sar Tzilam is that it's a metaphor for lack of courage. Another notion of another notion of Sar Tzilam is that it's a reference to spiritual exposure. And then here's a claim that it's not even a metaphor; it's an actual description. Right, we have throwing the shields away. But again, like two kinds of notions: lack of courage, right, in some way, or reflection of readiness to run, or spiritual exposure. Okay, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor comes up with a very has a very different notion of spiritual exposure. I assume that he has Rashi in front of him, but instead of saying that their spiritual exposure is a function of the death of the righteous, or of our entering, which that's a much later idea, he says, right, their sail is God. Right, God is the shadow and the guardian for all people. So God has removed his shade from them. If Kiram Lanu to give them over to us, but God is with us. Right, so this is Hashem Shomrecha, Hashem Tzilcha al Yad Yaminecha. All right, so we have a different use of shadow. Right, God is your shadow, and they no longer have God as their shadow. Okay, right, so it's spiritual exposure in the sense that, right, everybody, it seems, right, all human beings have kind of an Amud Anan around them, I guess, and they are now lacking. So that's an interesting, right? It's not that who they are is exposed spiritually, but somehow they lose divine protection. Okay, how do we know this? And what does it mean? I don't know. Mek Davar comes up with what I think is a utterly fascinating read of extension, I think, of Bechor Shor's idea. And Mek Davar always read the Netziv is always fascinating because he says things that I think really, he is a wild Mechtadesh, who I think never experiences himself as being original. He thinks he's saying Pashut Pshat, and you'll have to see how you react. He says, everybody has a mazal. Okay, what does a mazal mean? Right? And he connects this to Ugamosha Katuv B'Sefer Breshit Daled Yud Daled. So Breshit Daled Yud Daled is when Cain complains that, hey, you have chased me out today from the land. And whatever finds me will kill me. So, right, so that is the idea, right, that Cain so far, right, Cain has lost whatever ordinarily protects human beings. Right, and therefore you end up with the oath of Cain, the mark of Cain, to protect him. So what is this thing that has protected Cain, right? That's the same as before Shor. There's some kind of natural protection of human beings that God provided that is lacking. So the Tzif says over there, on Breaker Dali Dala, the Mash Adam, I know a little Nerag Mikol Chaya Hamazeket, Lomi Adam Hamazik, that people do not generally get killed by beasts or by damaging human beings. In the way that animals are subject to it. People don't ordinarily get injured by other people, as opposed to animals. It's a very interesting claim. I think that I live in a world where animals in ordinary life, just the kind of domestic animals he's talking about, I think aren't present in our lives enough that we could say, oh my goodness, animals often get hurt by people as opposed to humans. But apparently that is the Gemara's sense. So it says there are three reasons that's so. And the first one, the one that matters to us, is that Adam Isle Mazala, who could Isa Reish Masechet Avakama, Vehu Selam Elokim. So Chazanek Devar connects Sel to Selam. That's right. Selam is right that the Selam Elokim is that which protects human beings from being killed by animals. And what does that mean? So he tells you in Parashat Aleph Chavav, B'Talmenu, Habet Kimo B'Toch Talmenu. So don't think he says that human beings are created in the image of God, meaning sharing the image of God. And he's picking up on B'Talmenu Kid Mutenu. It's not even like the image of God. It means B'Toch Talmenu. Right? Within, right? This is the Rashi's model that Tzelem Elokim is the mold of God, perhaps. But maybe with our Tzelem. It's not that human beings are the Tzelem, but they're created with the Tzelem. And what does that mean? Shadam Yeshlo Mazal. Rashi Shabbat Samach Aleph Bet Shehu Malach. But the Tzelem Elokim is an angel. Avizehu Tzelem Elokim Hamistavavo Umegin Alav Minezek. So Chitziv has this very wild image that human beings are enclosed, surrounded by their Salem, right, which is actually their shadow, which their shadow. Really, the best way to translate Salem, it's a mold, but it's a mold that functions as a shadow, and it's that Selam Elokim that protects, that gives human beings that creates the Morah Shem V'Sichem, that creates the terror that animals have in the presence of human beings. And that's what the Canaanites lose. Right? In Cain, we're back to the Tzivos Parashat. Aside from the strength of their bodies, human beings also have a mazal, which is like a spiritual shadow in the physical world. And just like that, just like you have your shadow below, you also get protected by your angel in heaven. But Canaanites, but they are they're left purely physical. They don't have whatever this metaphysical dimension is. So I'm always uncomfortable with anytime somebody wants to claim that any group of human beings, even historical human beings, don't have their Tzelem Elokim. It's a little bit less troubling to be here because the Tzelem Elokim doesn't mean their spiritual stature. It's some kind of It's more like a force field generated around them. Very, very odd idea. The Civ consistently says that is that's what Tzelem Elokim means, and he makes some very strong claims about what Tzelem Elokim means. Right? He says, for example, therefore, people are not afraid of engaging in battles with oxen or with donkeys. Now, I don't, there is such a thing as bullfighting. I'm not aware of any sport of donkey fighting. There are people who wrestle alligators. I don't wrestle alligators, and I'm scared of dogs. So the whole idea is kind of difficult for me. I hope that I don't lack this Tzelem Elokim because I am more afraid of dogs than they are of me. But the Tziv claimed that even the human beings' capacity to dominate animals, even though animals are stronger than them, and he claims, right, and again, that It's not dangerous to be around animals. Even if because of your sins you don't succeed in killing the animal, but at least you escape. The animal doesn't kill you. Right? Just like people escape from animals they can't overpower. I really have no idea what the physical notion is talking about here. And I'm much happier with Selim Elohim being much more directly some sense of similarity to God as opposed, right? But what I get out of this, if it applies to, I suppose, in addition to just introducing the idea to you, is the idea that Sel and Selim are connected, and it is true. As Deborah says, that we eat animals far more often than they eat us. Of course, there are a lot more animals than there are us. And the reason that we're not eating animals, I think, is mostly we don't live around carnivores, and we do shoot them. We shoot man-eating tigers. But okay, I still, it's right. Despite that, I think that I'm probably more scared of tigers than they are of me. Although happily we have not had any close contact. Okay, Ramban, which is where the sieve was coming from. Ramban quotes Rashi, quotes he has a version of where for sure is in Rashi. I don't think we have that in Rashi, although maybe I missed it. That Shiloh Makom, that God's shade over them has left. And he quotes Ibn Ezra, and then he says a wholly different notion. Everybody knows that on the night in which your Sardin comes, you don't have a shadow. Right? So if you wander through the Canaanite culture, you would discover that the Canaanites are all vampires. They have all lost their shadows because you lose your shadow at least there was a night at which they all lost their shadow, because the night where death is decreed, you lose your shadow. He also refers to the angel above, but that's a fascinating notion which people pick up, that there's that maybe it's Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah is the night of Chasimas Gvardin. So here we have another very, I guess, literal claim. Sar Silam Melehem means that they have literally lost their shadows. So we'll see later, right? So there's so the Sofer says the same thing, and he really says death really comes in two parts. That's right. That you're losing your tail, right? It says right. That's and so the Nadav and Avihu really die by losing their tail before they finally die. And he explains some oddities about the text of the death of Nadav and Avihu, thereby claiming that there's two kinds of death. Rabbeinu Bechaya comes along, and he says, Kishiagia, quotes the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, Ad sheyafuach hayom v'nasu hasolalim, right? So when the day begins to fade and the shadows flee, so he takes that as reasonably as a metaphor for old age and the impending nature of death. And right, so the end is right. As you select silo, then a person loses their tzel and comes closer to the tzel of Hashem. That's what Hashem Tzilcha means. Lefize hayachol lomar b'nas hatzel. It said the shadow. These of Alamran v'asu hatzalim came shnayim badam bivo bavo to bavo. So this is right here. We're going beyond, I guess, my pay grade in a certain sense. There is a Gemara which says that the way in which you can tell the difference between human beings and demons is that human beings have umbras and penumbras. Our shadows have shadows, but demons' shadows don't have shadows. They live in a world which is much more black and white. Right, so there's no gray area around their shadow. I learned this because at some point, a junior counselor in a division I was counselor in decided to tell demon stories to a bunch a bunk of 10, 11-year-olds, and they were all utterly terrified that and that what appeared to be their counselors were actually demons, and they wanted us all to go stand under the light so they could examine our shadows. Okay, right. So that is a right. So here we have a very literal claim that Sar Silam means that death has been decreed upon them, and either their shadow or the shadow of their shadow or both have been eliminated as a result. Okay. But then, right, whatever. Aside from this interesting thing, I wanted to point out that at the end, he comes up with a connection you would expect that there's right. Lachmenuhem Sar Silam. Well, so Lechem refers to Pesach, and Silam means right, and Silam refers to Sukkah. So right, so art sale beats their sale. Okay, fine. Rabbi comes along and says that right, he's trying to connect this to the narrative that there are all these funerals when the spies come, and right, and the spies, the other 10 spies reach the conclusion as a result of this that the land is unhealthy, and he says, no, don't think the land is unhealthy, right? The Amrazeh, what they're saying by Sar Silam Aleichem is Tisharo made to Rabbi Misham Cholim Rabbi. They see lots of dying and sickly people there. Yeshua and Kalev say that this is it's not because they live in an environmentally polluted land, which is unhealthy. It's because they are a decadent culture. So they're right. Sar Silam Aleichem is not a positive thing. You don't have to be afraid of them because they lost their sale. It means you don't have to be afraid of the land because the people in it are dying not because of anything to do with the land, but because they've just reached a metaphysical condition of corruption. Okay, I again, what I would say at this point here is we have a number of attempts to try and explain what Yeshua and Kalev are saying to them. It's the Sar Silam, and it's not, to my mind, really terribly convincing. There's no argument you can verify, and saying I'm claiming that you saw that they didn't have shadows, and how are you explaining what's different from what the other 10 spies are saying, right? So this is now you can say, but that any convincing argument is obviously wrong as an explanation of what they're saying. It should, because in fact the reaction of the people is to stone them. You can read the first thing as they're saying, look, you know what? I know that they're militarily stronger than us, but I can tell you that they're psychologically in terror, and so you don't have to worry. And other people say, like, I think you're projecting. There's no reason they should be psychologically in terror. And again, like, how do you know this when the other 10 say that we look like grasshoppers to them? So that's right. And the claims of metaphysical that they're metaphysically already dead, that seems very strange and hard. And the notion that God has ceased to protect them, it's okay, but doesn't have any. It's not clear how we connect that to anything. Right? Why should that suddenly be true now? Why should they believe you? Not at all clear to me how any of these things actually. If these are all interpretations I had, I would say that I find this pasuk still enormously puzzling. Really, doesn't convince me at all. Okay, there is an interpretation that I really like, which I'm going to give you now, and you can tell me if you like it as well. Not, it's one of the things where I really like it, but it's also imports a presumption about the way in which the text functions. I think that this is, and I think I'm following Ramban in this generally. This is an organizing assumption of Chumash, and so it should not surprise you at all that it's referred to here. But you can tell me if you find it convincing or not. So here's the Maseh Hashem. This is a 16th or 17th century. I never quite remember. Right, it's a nephew of the Marik. It's 16th century. Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Ashkenazi commentary. Really interesting commentary. says the following. V'omrim sarat silam. So what does sarat silam mean? Bi'arnuhu b'mar'eh bein habitarim b'chelik bet. So we explained this about the Brit Benetar. Shemashi nemar sham shelo shalem avona emori. Zeu shamar kalev sarat silam shekvar shalem avona. Okay, right. So the claim of sarat silam is that we have a historical framing of the Jewish experience in Israel, which is that they're told that they have to be in Israel because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete, and everyone understands this, right? And so Yeshua and Kalev are saying is our perception of I would say their perception of their culture, although I could also be claiming some kind of prophetic insight, is that the time is up, and whatever the order of protection they were granted until such time as their measure of sin is fulfilled is over, and that's what the sale, specifically means. It's not a general divine protection; it's that specific decree that they could not be dispossessed until Shalem Avon Emory. Right, this is picked up by the 19th century real Moshe. Remember, this is a sort of amongst the Maskilim, Jewish Maskilim from Maskilim, 19th century. So b'brit be'atar l'ba im lagid Avram l'zaro sh'achar avdut Mitzrayim yitzbu l'chirut im kain b'chbid Mitzrayim avod alehem yiftechu b'gulatam. Right. So the advantage of having the brit be'atar is that they know, like Rabbi Akiva, that the worse it gets, right. So the terrible things are fulfillments of prophecy, and therefore redemption has to follow behind them. Right. So therefore he says, Israel mashamar le'Abraham. Certainly, all the Jews know that claim. Saying, you know that up until now, the Canaanites have lived in the shadow of God, who, for whatever reason, decreed that they were protected. But now their sin is complete and the time has come, and therefore right, so that's what Yeshua and Kalev are saying. Nothing about the military situation matters, because what we're just living in messianic times. Right, so this is a very interesting read of Yeshua and Kalev, and also interesting that it doesn't convince anybody. Okay, that I still think is really that's the explanation that I like best. It takes the sale as a metaphor, and it sort of builds on all the claim, as opposed to a general claim of spiritual exposure. It makes a very specific claim of divine protection and spiritual exposure. But I have to admit that I don't really have a prior use of the word sale in that sense. I understand why people are attracted to selling. There is another attempt to try and connect it to Psalm Mavet. But that also doesn't seem very compelling to this. The Psalm of it has certainly not been removed from them. Okay. Ibn Ezra Dilim tries to connect again, a different connection to Psalm. He makes a connection, keep it Psalm, and came up with Psalm of it. But he thinks that really other totally wild interpretation of but Tselem means something changeable. Right, the Tselem, but this again connects us to the astrological realm. Very, very odd. Okay. Rechaim connects it to the Tzotz HaMechayeotam, Klapper right, spark that keeps them alive. Very interesting to compare a shadow to a spark. But let's right. So the last thing I want to show you is that the Rechaim connects this. Right, it says Sartilam Elehem. So he can So he says he connects it into a larger narrative where the Jews are also perhaps worried about having lost their sale. So he says Kifaruhu Perush Sartilam Elehem. Right, that when the Jews leave, when the Jews in the aftermath of the Chet Egel, so Moshe sees the Jews Perua, and what is right, which also in some Perua can also mean uncovered and exposed. So it means Perush, right? And it's obvious the Ohr HaChaim is trying to make the connection to our pasuk. Starts Yilam Me'alehem. The Jews lose their sale after the Cheder Egel. Ki Noam Hashem Haya Alehem Miyom Shekiblu HaTorah V'Husar Mesuchatam. Right. So whatever, some aura of God was upon them, and it's right, and now their covering has been removed. And you can see the same image, and he says, "What right? Ki for Aharon." So why is Aaron responsible for their uncovering? So Aaron, for the Jews, right, he claims that Aaron is blameless in the Egel. Aaron serves the same function for the Jews. So the Jews coming to Canaan, serve to the Canaanites allegedly, right, which is to expose their sins by their relative innocence. So that's a very strong reading of the story of the Egel, that Aaron is so virtuous by comparison that exposes the sin of the Jews. The challenge of Ohr HaChaim's reading is, if the Jews have lost their sale also, so all Kalev Yeshua are saying is they're the same as us. So why is that a convincing argument at all? So I think you'd have to claim either that the word sale is a general word of referring to aura. The Jews have lost one kind of aura, but the Canaanites have lost an even more basic aura. I think you'd have to make a claim like that. I don't really have a way of making it convincing. One could claim that, after all this, that Sarat Silam is an idiom that anyone in biblical times would have recognized immediately. Everyone understands that Sarat Silam means that they're in a condition of extreme vulnerability, and you shouldn't spend so much time thinking about the theology or the etymology of the idiom, because it just means that they're toast, right? We're trying to figure out what does it mean to say that somebody is toast? We can have all sorts of theories as to how we get back to claiming somebody is toast. It's because there were toasters, and when you ring, and at the end, when the toast is done, it rings a bell, and so to be toast is to mean that you're already done. But that's not, say you're toast, but you sort of all get it. I don't know. So let's present as a pure parshanut shir. I think it in the end it takes what seems like a fairly straightforward, intuitive notion. Then you can see people are struggling because what makes it intuitive, that there's some kind of intuitive sense people have that to lose your shadow is to make you vulnerable, or right? But it's not clear. Is it losing your shadow, or is it losing the thing which gives you shade? Right. So we wanted to do a straight philological analysis. That would be it. Right. Is their sale the thing, the shade that they provide, or is their sale the thing that gives them shade? Is it somehow related to death, like the sale mavet, or is it related to the thing which gives you life, which is its selam? Does it mean that there's something fundamental about them that's lost, or does it mean that there's something that was protecting them from us that's lost, or does it mean that somehow God is not shielding them as He had been previously? I think I have the parish I like, which is the Maseh Hashem and Hoyel Moshe, but I can't claim that from a pure parshanut perspective it's the most convincing. Okay, that's all I have to say this week. If anybody has comments, you're welcome to make them.
Hi. Hi. Is it possible that Bnei Israel didn't understand what Kalev and Yeshua were saying?
Right, that's a very tempting thing to say. Like, why are Bnei Israel and convinced? Because they just don't understand, right? Kalev and Yeshua are talking about the Nitziv, and and they're all rationalists, and right, or rationalists not the right, but none of them right. They don't believe in astrology, but or they don't know what the right. We're dealing with a level of abstraction so high that they don't get it. It's tempting to say that. That what we have here is a lack of communication, and the Bnei Israel don't really understand what Kalev and Yeshua are saying any more than we do. It's very tempting. It's very tempting. I don't have any way of evaluating such a claim. Other than just intuitive feeling. Does it make sense that that's what's going on, or is it not? And then it would be interesting if we then connected. Kalev isn't really much of a character in the rest of, but Yeshua is. We could try and talk about whether Yeshua learns how to adapt his rhetoric from this episode, or is there a weakness of Yeshua? I think Yeshua generally is effective rhetorically. So it would be really interesting to try and see if we can find places later where Yeshua is consciously recognizing that his rhetoric wasn't effective previously. That would be cool if it were true. I don't have any basis for such a theory. It would be cool if it were true.
Right. So the other thing is, I mean, it would seem that any meaning that's based on this notion of that the inhabitants, were somehow physically vulnerable now, that would be difficult because, the other 10 spies just made a very, very compelling argument for their physical superiority. Number one. Number two, Sale, I mean, if you interpret, if you understand it as Silam, meaning the kind of seemingly most direct meaning of it, which is their shadow, right?
Mhm.
Your shadow, it doesn't protect you, right? Your shadow trails you. It's, that's why the way you explain, some of the other interpretations are, people twist it into meanings, the thing that provides cover to the inhabitants. But the most direct meaning is really, if it's their shadow, then it's not something that's physically protecting them. So it seemed to be, again, some aspect of, some element of their personhood or identity, or spiritual wholeness, is already flawed, right? And we can go in there. And the other aspect of thinking of them as physically vulnerable and fearful, I think it's somewhat telescoping to project what Rachav says, onto, that's 40 years later, right? And it's after Bnei Israel have already, assertively entered Canaan and are clearly, beginning conquest. Whereas here, they haven't done anything yet. So other than, again, and God hasn't done anything yet other than, splitting the Red Sea. But so again, it would seem to be difficult to explain it as some sort of notion of Kaleb and Yefuna, Kaleb and Yoshua really being directly contradictory to what the others have said in terms of the physical vulnerability of the inhabitants.
Okay, so I guess the responses to that are, on the first one, is it more convincing to read as their shadow than the thing which gives them shade? So Hashem Tzilcha Yad Minecha is a pretty good puzzle, right? You have to grant that.
Mm.
That if God is your tail, right, God is your shadow.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So that's right. That's a reasonable response. On the second claim, so the only issue you do have as Yashir, which already says Never Go Kol Yoshvei Chanan, but there's nothing here that specifically, so you have to why is that true? So obviously Rachav goes back. This is written by and then the other issue is, of course, the next episode was spies, is Rachav, right? So it's not so wild to claim that to read the episode of Rachav back because it's the next episode with the spies. So I don't think it's so bad. I agree with you that it's not wholly convincing, but I don't think it's so bad because of those connections. And then the question, then you have the question when you're reading rhetoric and counter rhetoric. So you have to try to figure out. So what could Yoshua and Kaleb say that would be the most effective response to the claim of physical superiority? And I don't know that there's any really good response other than saying, no, it's really not true. We saw them, and you're just right. You were just looking at them, from the wrong angle, and from we saw them from a different angle, and they're really not 7 feet tall. They're really only 5'11". Yeah, I don't know. I don't know which way that works. So, I don't argue with you, and as I say, I don't have a really convincing parish, but I don't know. But I think that all the interpretations have reason, right? Some people say, the response to a claim of physical superiority is, but we have mental toughness, right? What the coaches of the scrappy teams tell you when you go up against the far more athletically talented team. As long as we have mental discipline, we'll win. Right? There are all sorts of armies that are built on that on that notion that that our discipline and our courage and our will win. And then there are people who think that now the only response to a claim of physical failure is a physical strength is some kind of metaphysical strength, and just referring to psychology isn't good enough. And then some people have said metaphysical strength isn't enough. You have to have a specific metaphysical cause. Okay, I don't have more than that. Thank you as always.
Okay, thanks.
And we got 2 more weeks of this, I think. So I hope I will still see you next week.
Okay, all right.
Shalom.
Take care. Bye.